I stood frozen in horror on my front porch, watching as Officer Bryant loaded Cooper, my blind son Michael's golden retriever guide dog, into the back of his patrol car. Michael, only 16, sat sobbing on our front lawn, his hands grasping at the empty air where Cooper should have been, his white cane tossed carelessly aside in the chaos. Beside him, Margaret Wilson, the HOA president of Pine Grove Estates, smirked with a satisfaction that churned my stomach, her arms crossed as if she'd just won a long-fought battle. 20 years enforcing federal law as a judge, and now I was witnessing it trampled in my own yard. What would anyone do if someone tried to steal their disabled child's lifeline and thought they could get away with it? Just over a year ago, Michael lost his sight in a car accident that also took his mother, leaving me a widowed father raising a newly disabled teen, desperate for a fresh start. Cooper wasn't just a pet. He was Michael's eyes, his confidence, his bridge to a world that had turned dark overnight, and after months of training, he'd become his key to independence. We moved to Pine Grove 2 weeks earlier, drawn by its tree-lined streets, excellent schools, and the promise of a tight-knit community. Everything the sales agent boasted about. But I'd kept my profession as a federal judge private during HOA interviews, wanting us to be treated like any other family, not granted special treatment because of my position. That day, watching Michael venture into the neighborhood with Cooper, his steps growing surer with every stride, I'd thought we'd found healing. How wrong I was to think a simple act of independence wouldn't ignite a campaign of cruelty that would test my patience as a father and the limits of my judicial restraint. It started with a letter slipped under our door 3 days after Cooper's first walk, like some covert threat. Violation, unauthorized animal on premises, $750 fine, immediate removal required. My hands trembled not from fear, but from a rage I hadn't felt since presiding over civil rights cases. Yet I stayed calm, calling an emergency HOA meeting with Cooper's service animal certification and ADA documentation in hand. Margaret barely glanced at the papers before sliding them back with a flick of her manicured nails, her eyes narrowing at Michael, who sat quietly beside me, Cooper still at his feet. "Your situation doesn't exempt you from our covenant," she said coolly. "Some residents find certain disabilities unsettling, the visibility of it all." I explained, voice level from years of judicial composure, that the Americans with Disabilities Act explicitly protects service animals, superseding HOA rules, but she exchanged glances with her board, dismissing me with, "We've had others claim special status before, Mr. Parker. This is an exclusive community. Rules maintain our standards." A board member whispered, "That's Judge Parker," recognition dawning, but Margaret's eyebrow only arched as she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Your profession doesn't grant exemptions here. This isn't your courtroom. Perhaps Pine Grove isn't the right fit for your situation." As we left, Michael whispered, "Dad, why do they hate Cooper so much?" I couldn't tell him the truth, that it was Cooper, but his blindness that threatened Margaret's vision of a perfect community. So I just rested my hand on his shoulder, silently vowing their prejudice wouldn't drive us out. What followed was a calculated campaign of intimidation that would have impressed the seasoned prosecutors I'd worked with. Security cameras suddenly installed facing our home. Neighbors documenting our every move with raised smartphones whenever Michael and Cooper stepped outside. 3 anonymous calls to animal control claiming Cooper was aggressive. All dismissed after inspections found a perfectly trained service animal. Each visit left Michael more anxious, more reluctant to leave the house, and when he tried joining teens at the community pool, Margaret intervened, loudly announcing his special needs required supervision, escorting him out while citing liability to onlookers. That night his voice broke. "I've never done anything to these people, Dad. Cooper doesn't bark or cause trouble." I documented everything, recordings, emails, photos, statements from a few sympathetic neighbors, knowing exactly what constituted harassment and discrimination. But I kept my profession strategic, my silence an advantage as the HOA issued new rules targeting us. DNA registration for animals, monthly medical verification for special accommodations, muzzles for trained animals in common areas, fines piling into thousands. When I contested them, Margaret's response was a letter claiming my complaints disrupted community harmony, threatening lien proceedings. Yet I held my ground, waiting for the moment they'd overstep too far. The tension in Pine Grove estate simmered beneath the surface. A quiet war waged through petty regulations and whispered complaints, until it erupted into something undeniable that Tuesday afternoon. Michael had a mobility training session after school, so I dropped him and Cooper off before heading to court, where I was presiding over a complex interstate commerce case that demanded my full attention, until my clerk rushed in during a recess, phone in hand, urgency in her eyes. "Judge Parker, it's an emergency. Your son called from home," she said, and Michael's trembling voice crackled through the speaker. "Dad, they're here, police, animal control. Margaret's saying Cooper attacked someone. They're trying to take him away. I don't know what to do." I could hear the chaos in the background, multiple voices, Cooper's confused whining, Margaret's shrill accusations slicing through it all. So I told him, stay calm, put Cooper on his lead, show them his service vest and ID. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Don't let them take him without documentation." Racing home, the pieces of Margaret's plan clicked into place. She'd orchestrated an emergency HOA vote on dangerous animals while I was stuck in court, announced in a newsletter with barely 24 hours, notice conveniently misdelivered to our neighbor's mailbox. Then she'd made her move, calling police with a baseless claim that Cooper threatened a child during his morning walk. No witnesses, no evidence, just her word against a disabled teenagers. By the time I turned onto our street, a small crowd had gathered, Officer Bryant standing beside his patrol car, its rear door open, Cooper already halfway inside, while Michael sat disoriented on the lawn, tears streaming down his face, reaching blindly into the emptiness where his guide dog should have been. Margaret was mid-performance, telling the neighbors, "The dog lunged at the Peterson boy. We've had concerns for months. Just because the child is blind doesn't mean we should risk community safety." Several nodded in agreement, and Mrs. Peterson, standing nervously nearby, nudged her young son forward, who mumbled. He growled at me, though his eyes darted with uncertainty, clearly coached. Michael cried out, "That's impossible. Cooper was on my left side the whole time. He never breaks position. He's trained." Margaret cut in, "See how emotional the boy gets. This is the instability we're concerned about." I approached slowly, taking in every detail. Officer Bryant's discomfort, the animal control van idling at the curb, Margaret's triumphant smirk, my son's anguish. 15 years on the federal bench had taught me timing was everything, and I needed to see how far they'd go, who was involved, before I played my hand. "Officer," I said calmly, "may I ask what's happening here?" He replied, "Sir, we've received reports of an aggressive animal. I'm following protocol." Margaret stepped forward. "We're finally addressing the situation, Mr. Parker. You were warned, rules exist for everyone's protection." I looked at Michael, his hands grasping for Cooper, his entire world being stripped away by neighborhood prejudice masquerading as policy, and something in me shifted irrevocably. "You should have followed the rules from the beginning," Margaret shouted, pointing at Cooper, who sat perfectly behaved despite the chaos. "Special treatment leads to chaos, first dogs, then who knows what kind of people move in next." The crowd murmured agreement, smartphones recording, Officer Bryant checking Cooper's tags, preparing paperwork, visibly uneasy but proceeding. "There's a process for accommodations," Margaret continued, playing to her audience. "You can't just move in and expect everyone to change for you. This neighborhood has standards." Michael's silent tears, his fingers clutching empty air, broke something fundamental inside me. I'd watched him fight to reclaim his life after the accident, only to see it dismantled by small-minded cruelty. Mrs. Davidson, our elderly neighbor, finally spoke. "Margaret, this is going too far. The boy needs his dog." Margaret snapped. "Stay out of this, Helen. Your property values are at stake, too." "Do you want to live next to a—" She stopped, but the implication hung heavy. This wasn't about rules or safety. It was about who she deemed acceptable in her perfect community. "Officer," I said, stepping forward, "before you continue, I'd like to understand the specific complaint authorizing seizure of a service animal." Bryant hesitated. "Sir, I have a report of aggressive behavior toward a minor." I pressed. "What evidence supports this? Witnesses besides the complainant, previous incidents, actual injury?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no physical contact was reported, but—" Mrs. Peterson interjected. "He bared his teeth at my boy." Nudging Tommy, who stammered, "The dog looked at me." Michael's hands clenched, his breathing quickening, an anxiety attack I'd seen too often since his accident, and Cooper strained toward him from the patrol car, sensing his distress. 15 years of judicial restraint evaporated. "Officer Bryant," I said, voice deadly calm, "I have information that will change how you proceed in the next 30 seconds. Margaret stepped between us. "Don't intimidate him. The law's clear about dangerous animals." Meeting her gaze, I replied, "Yes, it is, and you're about to learn exactly how clear it is." The crowd fell silent, sensing the shift in the air as Margaret's smirk faltered, her confidence teetering on the edge of collapse. She'd miscalculated, and I was done watching from the sidelines. Removing my overcoat to reveal the suit I'd worn to court that morning, I reached for my credentials, approaching Officer Bryant with the measured pace I used when delivering rulings that changed lives. The neighbors parted instinctively, something in my demeanor commanding their attention, and I presented my identification, stating firmly, "Officer, I'm Federal Judge Samuel Parker, Eastern District. That service animal is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and what's happening here constitutes criminal discrimination against a disabled minor." Bryant's eyes widened as he examined my credentials, the weight of the situation dawning on him, while Margaret's face morphed from smugness to horror, her voice stammering. "You never said you were a judge," I turned to her unflinching, "and you never said you were targeting my son because of his disability, yet here we are." Addressing the crowd directly, I raised my voice. "For those recording, keep going. You're documenting federal violations, conspiracy to violate civil rights, discrimination under the ADA, harassment of a protected individual." Bryant stepped back from the patrol car, hands raised slightly. "Judge Parker, I was told this was an unlicensed, aggressive animal. Had I known," I cut in, "I understand you were misled, but why wasn't standard procedure followed to verify service animal status before attempting removal?" He paled. "Sir, I deeply apologize. This should never have happened." Cooper bolted from the patrol car, racing to Michael's side, pressing against him as my son wrapped his arms around his guide dog, relief washing over his tear-streaked face, his lifeline restored in an instant. I turned back to Margaret, my voice steady but cutting. "You scheduled this emergency HOA vote during my court hours deliberately. You falsified reports to animal control. You've engaged in systematic discrimination against a disabled minor, each action carrying significant federal penalties." She backed away, looking to her neighbors for support, but found only shocked stares, her authority unraveling. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "We have HOA regulations that clearly—" I interrupted. "No private regulation supersedes federal law, something you've been reminded of multiple times in writing." Suddenly, 3 neighbors stepped forward. The Johnsons, whose adopted kids were banned from the pool, Mr. Rivera, whose mother's wheelchair ramp was cited as a nuisance, and Mrs. Patel fined for her religious decorations. "It wasn't just them," Mrs. Patel said quietly. "She's done this to many of us." Margaret's facade crumbled as she realized her misstep had exposed a deeper rot, her desperate hiss, "This is my community. I've worked years to maintain its standards," met my firm reply. "Your vendetta just triggered a federal investigation into this entire HOA. Everyone involved will be subpoenaed. I suggest you get legal counsel immediately." Officer Bryant snapped into action. "Sir, I'm releasing the service animal back to your son immediately," securing the patrol car door before turning to me. "I'll need to file a corrected report." I nodded, maintaining my professional calm. "I'd like to formally file a report myself, systematic harassment of a disabled minor. I have documentation of 6 false reports by Ms. Wilson, constituting harassment and filing false statements to law enforcement." Handing him a USB drive, I added, "This contains 3 months of evidence, time-stamped recordings of HOA meetings where my son's disability was called undesirable, emails coordinating today's events, witness statements from residents facing similar discrimination." Margaret tried to interject, her voice weak. "This is a private community matter," I countered. "It stopped being private when you weaponized law enforcement against a disabled child. Each participant today is potentially liable in criminal and civil proceedings." The crowd began to disperse, neighbors eager to distance themselves, but the Johnsons, Mr. Rivera and Mrs. Patel stayed. "Judge Parker," Mrs. Johnson said, "our adopted kids were banned from activities because they didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic." Margaret said it lowered appeal. Mr. Rivera added. My mother's wheelchair ramp got daily fines until she stopped visiting. Margaret called it advertising infirmity. Mrs. Patel chimed in. My Diwali decorations were excessive, but Christmas displays 3 times larger got awards. Margaret's face flushed with anger. You're all exaggerating. I've maintained property values for everyone. Without standards, this neighborhood would collapse. Mrs. Patel shot back. Standards or prejudice? Bryant, now fully grasping the situation, turned to Margaret. Ma'am, I'll need you to come to the station for a statement about today's complaint. She protested. That won't be necessary. I'm withdrawing it. He replied. Filing a false police report is a criminal offense. That's not how this works. As she was escorted to the patrol car, her phone buzzed incessantly, board members realizing their liability, her power evaporating in minutes. A text circulated the neighborhood. Emergency community meeting, 7:00 p.m. Clubhouse. By then, everyone knew who I was, and the carefully curated facade of Pine Grove Estates was cracking, revealing the rot beneath. The emergency community meeting that night was unlike anything Pine Grove Estates had ever seen. Standing room only, the clubhouse buzzing with a mix of tension and revelation as neighbors who'd avoided eye contact for months approached us with apologies and outrage. Decades of buried grievances found voice, the air thick with the weight of what had been unspoken, and Margaret arrived flanked by 2 board members, her composure forcibly pieced back together but her authority in tatters. She took the podium as if it were a routine HOA gathering, her voice clipped and rehearsed. Today's unfortunate incident has been resolved. Officer Bryant misunderstood community protocols regarding animals. We've clarified the matter. But Bryant himself interrupted from the back, his tone firm. That's not true. I was explicitly told to remove a dangerous animal. The complaint came directly from you, Ms. Wilson. Before she could recover, Mrs. Davidson, our 78-year-old neighbor, stood shakily, her voice trembling with years of frustration. For 3 years, I've been fined for having my grandson visit more than twice a month. Margaret said children reduced the community. Mature atmosphere. One by one, residents rose, their stories pouring out like a dam breaking. The Hernandez family denied a safety fence after their toddler wandered toward the pond. Dr. Way, whose home-based medical practice for terminal patients led to towed vehicles labeled commercial activity. A dozen more tales, each more disturbing than the last, painting a picture of systematic exclusion. Margaret's protests grew shrill. This is absurd. These measures protected our property values and community standards. But a former board member stood, visibly nervous, his confession cutting through her denial. I resigned last year because I couldn't stomach it anymore. Margaret said in a closed meeting that the right kind of residents don't need accommodations. She told us to find any violation possible for households that didn't fit the neighborhood profile. Someone pressed, profile. He nodded grimly. You know what she meant. Young families were too noisy. Ethnic foods created offensive odors. Religious minorities had excessive gatherings. Disabilities were visual disruptions. Margaret lunged for the microphone. These accusations are defamatory. I've dedicated years to this community's prestige. I rose from my seat, voice calm but unyielding, by bullying the vulnerable. I could pursue federal charges against this HOA for systematic civil rights violations. The evidence I've collected would be compelling in court. The room fell silent, every eye on me, but I continued. Prosecution isn't my goal. My son and I came here seeking community, not conflict. What happens next is up to you all. The vote that followed was unprecedented in Pine Grove's history. Unanimous dissolution of the current board, freezing of HOA funds pending investigation, and formation of a resident committee to establish new governance. Margaret stormed out, her real estate business already crumbling as word spread beyond our streets. As the meeting dissolved, something remarkable unfolded. Residents who'd never spoken began introducing themselves, exchanging numbers, making plans. The clubhouse, once a sterile space for approved gatherings, hummed with connection. Michael whispered beside me, Cooper steady at his side. Dad, what's happening now? I described the scene. Elderly neighbors offering rides to younger ones, families swapping contact info, a community emerging from fear's shadow. I think, I told him, we're finally meeting our neighbors. Rather than pushing for maximum penalties, I offered a choice, prosecution or reformation. The legal path was clear, with evidence of multiple federal violations that could have led to crippling fines and criminal charges for board members. But Michael had reminded me of something I'd told him after his accident. Justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. Led by residents who'd stood with us that day, Mrs. Davidson, the Johnsons, Mr. Rivera, Mrs. Patel, Pine Grove began to transform. A diverse governance committee drafted new bylaws rooted in transparency and inclusion, every rule vetted by a simple question. Does this serve all residents or only some? The shift was palpable, the community's heart beating anew, and I realized this wasn't just about us anymore. It was about everyone Margaret had silenced. That night, as I watched from our porch, the weight of the day settled into a quiet resolve. Michael slept soundly for the first time in weeks, Cooper curled at his feet, and I knew we'd turned a corner. The neighbors who'd nodded along to Margaret's lies were now questioning their silence, some already approaching me privately with confessions, admitting they'd feared becoming targets themselves. Mrs. Patel had said it best at the meeting. We didn't know how to stop it. But now they did. Together, they dismantled a system built on exclusion, and in its place, something real was taking root. The next morning, I found a note slipped under our door. Not a violation this time, but a thank you from the Johnsons, promising to fight for a pool accessible to all kids, a small sign that Pine Grove was waking up. The transformation of Pine Grove Estates began quietly but grew with a momentum that surprised even me. A federal judge accustomed to seeing change enforced through rulings rather than born from the ground up. In the days following the emergency meeting, the new resident committee, led by Mrs. Davidson, the Johnsons, Mr. Rivera, and Mrs. Patel, wasted no time, meeting nightly in the clubhouse to draft bylaws that prioritized inclusion over exclusion, transparency over secrecy. Every regulation was scrutinized with a single guiding question. Does this serve all residents or only some? The clubhouse itself, once a sterile symbol of Margaret's control, became a true community hub. Seniors who'd been isolated found companionship over coffee, families with special needs formed support networks, and cultural celebrations, once fined as disruptive, were now planned as community-wide events. Michael, finding a purpose I hadn't expected, took the lead in his own way, establishing a youth advocacy program with teens who'd witnessed his humiliation that day on the lawn, kids who now listened as he taught them about disability rights and community responsibility. Under his guidance, they developed an accessibility initiative that would later spread to neighborhoods across the county, turning his pain into a quiet triumph that made me prouder than any courtroom victory ever had. Cooper, once branded a threat by Margaret's lies, became Pine Grove's unofficial mascot. Children who'd been taught to fear him now ran to pet him, learning from Michael how to interact with service animals, his daily rounds a welcome sight rather than a cause for suspicion. The most profound changes came in unexpected ways. Mr. Chun, previously fined for excessive gardening, opened his spectacular backyard for community classes, teaching neighbors to grow their own food. Mrs. Rivera's mother, once unwelcome due to her wheelchair, became the beloved organizer of neighborhood history projects, her sharp mind and warm smile drawing people in. The Johnsons, adopted kids, banned from activities for not fitting the aesthetic, formed a multicultural youth committee that organized our first community festival, music, food, and laughter spilling across lawns that had once been silent battlegrounds. Margaret's former allies approached me one by one, their confessions whispered over fences or on porches. Some had feared becoming targets themselves, others hadn't realized the depth of her discrimination until it was laid bare. Each said the same thing. We didn't know how to stop it. And I believed them, because fear can silence even the well-intentioned until someone breaks the spell. 6 months after that confrontation on our lawn, I stood on our porch watching Michael and Cooper lead a community walk for disability awareness. Dozens of neighbors, many who'd stood by as he was humiliated, now walked beside him, listening as he navigated with a confidence I hadn't seen since before the accident. Mrs. Davidson joined me, her voice soft but firm. Your Honor, I never thought I'd live to see Pine Grove become a real community. I smiled, it's just Sam now, but she shook her head. Not to us. You reminded us justice isn't just for courtrooms, sometimes it happens right where we live. She was right. When power is abused, it's not enough to punish the guilty. True justice builds something better from the wreckage, and that day could have ended in lawsuits and a fractured neighborhood, but instead it sparked a rebirth. Pine Grove was proof that confronting discrimination doesn't just protect the vulnerable, it liberates everyone. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now greeted each other by name. The community Margaret claimed to protect through exclusion flourishing through inclusion. Its property values rising not despite our diversity, but because of it, a fact that would have infuriated her if she'd stayed to see it. As for Margaret, word trickled back that she was facing multiple civil suits from residents she'd wronged. Her real estate license suspended pending an investigation into discriminatory practices. Mandatory sensitivity training was the least of her worries, though I doubted it would change her. Her absence left a void that Pine Grove filled with something stronger, and I realized Michael had been right that night he'd sat in the dark, Cooper's head in his lap, whispering, "They want us gone because I'm blind, don't they?" He'd seen the truth before I did, but he'd also shown me something else. Courage in the face of cruelty could change more than just one boy. It could change an entire community. That walk he led wasn't just a statement. It was a promise, one I saw reflected in every neighbor who joined him, a promise that Pine Grove would never go back to what it had been. The air in Pine Grove estates felt lighter as the months rolled on. The shadow of Margaret's reign lifting like fog burned away by morning sun. Neighbors who'd once scurried past with downcast eyes now lingered to chat, their voices mingling with laughter that hadn't echoed here in years. The community walk Michael led had been a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who'd joined, a quiet declaration that this neighborhood belonged to all of us, not just the few Margaret had deemed worthy. The youth advocacy program he'd started grew beyond my expectations. Teenagers who'd once watched his humiliation from the sidelines now met weekly in our living room, drafting proposals for accessibility ramps, braille signage, and service animal education. Their ideas catching the attention of the county council, which invited Michael to present his initiative at a regional meeting. Watching him stand there, Cooper steady at his side, explaining how inclusion strengthened communities, I saw a resilience I hadn't fully grasped. He'd taken the cruelty meant to break him and turned it into a tool to build something better, a legacy that reached far beyond Pine Grove's tree-lined streets. The physical changes in the neighborhood mirrored the shift in its soul. The clubhouse, once a fortress of exclusivity, now hosted potlucks where Mr. Chun's homegrown vegetables starred alongside Mrs. Patel's spicy samosas, the scents wafting through open windows as kids darted between tables, no longer policed for being too noisy. Mrs. Rivera's mother rolled her wheelchair proudly across a new ramp, installed without a single fine, leading discussions on Pine Grove's history, her stories drawing crowds that included the Johnsons, adopted kids, who traded their exclusion for a stage at the festival, performing a dance that blended their heritages into something vibrant and new. Cooper, ever the gentle ambassador, padded alongside Michael on their daily rounds, his wagging tail a signal that all were welcome. Parents now taught their children to approach him with respect, a stark contrast to the fear Margaret had sown with her lies. Even the HOA's old guard, those who'd quietly supported her, began to soften. Mr. Thompson, a board member who'd nodded along to her rules, stopped by one evening with a bottle of wine and an apology, admitting he'd been too afraid to challenge her, his regret genuine as he asked how he could help the new committee moving forward. I found myself reflecting on justice more than I ever had in my courtroom. There, it was a gavel strike, a sentence handed down, but here it was messier, more human, a slow unfurling of trust and accountability that didn't end with punishment, but with possibility. The evidence I'd gathered, those recordings, emails, and statements, sat untouched in my safe, a weapon I could have wielded to bury Margaret and her allies in federal charges, yet I'd chosen restraint, guided by Michael's words after his accident. Justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. That choice paid off in ways I couldn't have predicted. Neighbors who'd feared speaking out now volunteered for the governance committee, their voices shaping rules that served everyone, not just the privileged few. The fines that had once crippled families were replaced by a fund to support community projects, like the sensory garden Michael's group, designed for kids with disabilities. Property values, Margaret's sacred metric, climbed higher than ever, not because of her sterile uniformity, but because Pine Grove's inclusive model drew families from across the region. Its story featured in a local paper under the headline, "From Exclusion to Embrace." One evening, as I sat on the porch with Mrs. Davidson, she handed me a cup of tea and said, "Sam, you didn't just save your boy, you saved us all from what we'd let ourselves become." I shook my head. It was Michael's courage, not mine, but she insisted. "You gave us the chance to choose better, and we did." She was right. That day on the lawn could have torn Pine Grove apart, lawsuits splintering what little unity remained, but instead it became a catalyst, a crack through which light poured in. Michael joined us, Cooper flopping at his feet, and asked, "Dad, do you think they'd have listened if you weren't a judge?" I thought of the neighbors who'd stepped forward, the ones who'd stayed after Margaret left, and said, "Maybe not at first, but it's not my title that changed this place. It's what you showed them, that standing up matters no matter who's watching." He smiled, a rare, unguarded grin, and I knew Pine Grove wasn't just our home. It was our proof that even the smallest voices, given a chance, could rewrite a community's story. The seasons shifted in Pine Grove estates, leaves falling and then blooming again, each cycle marking a deeper rooting of the community we'd fought to reclaim. Where once there'd been silence broken only by Margaret's edicts, now there was a steady hum of life, neighbors weaving a tapestry of connection that felt both fragile and unbreakable. Michael's accessibility initiative had taken on a life of its own, the county adopting it as a model for other neighborhoods, and I watched him evolve from a boy who'd sat sobbing on our lawn to a young man who spoke at council meetings with a quiet authority that reminded me of myself in my early judicial days. Cooper remained his constant shadow, the golden retriever's presence a bridge between Michael and a world that had once seemed determined to shut him out. Kids from the youth program now trailed him on walks, asking questions about blindness and service animals, their curiosity replacing the fear Margaret had instilled. The clubhouse, reborn as a community heart, pulsed with activity. Mr. Chun's gardening classes spilled into spring planting days, Mrs. Rivera's mother led oral history nights that drew packed rooms, and the Johnsons' kids turned their festival dance into an annual tradition, a celebration of diversity that drew crowds from beyond our borders. I'd expected resistance. Old habits die hard, and Margaret's allies hadn't all vanished. But the shift was undeniable. Even Mr. Thompson, once her silent enforcer, joined the governance committee, his hands steady as he helped draft bylaws that protected rather than punished. Neighbors who'd avoided us now stopped by with small gestures. A plate of cookies from Mrs. Patel, a wave from Dr. Way as he tended his patients, each a thread in a web of trust that grew stronger with every passing day. The fines and violations that had once choked Pine Grove were gone, replaced by a community fund that paid for things like the sensory garden, its winding paths and fragrant plants a haven for kids like Michael, a project he'd envisioned and seen through with a determination that left me in awe. Property values soared, a final irony Margaret would have hated. Realtors now touted our inclusivity as a selling point. Families moving in because of the story we'd become, not despite it. The regional recognition a quiet rebuke to her vision of sterile perfection. One afternoon, as I sorted through old case files in my study, Michael came in, Cooper's nails clicking on the hardwood, and sat across from me, his voice thoughtful. "Dad, losing my sight taught me we don't choose our challenges, but we choose how they change us. Do you think that's why this worked?" I set the papers aside, meeting his unseeing gaze, and said, "You showed them that, son. You didn't just endure. You built something from it, and they couldn't ignore that kind of strength." He nodded, then added, "I heard Margaret's facing more lawsuits. People she bullied are suing her now." It was true. Her real estate empire was collapsing under civil suits, her license suspension just the start, sensitivity training a footnote in a reckoning she'd never anticipated. I'd chosen not to pursue federal charges, not out of mercy, but because Pine Grove's transformation was a better justice. Punishing her wouldn't have healed what she'd broken, but this living proof of what we'd made, did. "She underestimated you," I told him, "and everyone else she thought she could control." That evening the neighborhood gathered for the sensory garden's opening. Michael cut the ribbon, Cooper wagging beside him, and I stood back as residents explored the space. their voices a chorus of pride and belonging. Mrs. Davidson found me again, her eyes bright. "Sam, this is what justice looks like. Not a gavel, but a garden, a place where everyone fits." I nodded, watching Michael guide a group of kids through the paths, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves, and thought of the day I'd revealed my title, the power I'd wielded not to destroy, but to demand a choice. Pine Grove had chosen restoration over retribution, and in doing so, it had liberated itself. Neighbors who'd once lived in Margaret's shadow now stood in the sun, their community a testament to what happens when courage meets compassion. Michael's words lingered with me. We don't choose our challenges, but we choose how they change us, and Pine Grove, like my son, had chosen to grow. The Pine Grove estates of today bears little resemblance to the stifled enclave Margaret Wilson once ruled. Its streets now alive with a vibrancy that spills from porches and playgrounds, a community no longer defined by exclusion, but by the strength of its embrace. Michael's youth advocacy program has become a cornerstone, training a generation of teens who advocate for accessibility not just here but across the county. His voice, once silenced by tears on our lawn, now a steady force that inspires change, Cooper ever at his side like a golden thread tying past struggles to present victories. The sensory garden flourishes, its paths worn by neighbors who gather there daily. Mr. Chun tends the herbs, Mrs. Rivera's mother shares stories under the shade of a new pavilion, and the Johnsons, kids lead games that echo with laughter, their once band energy now a vital pulse in Pine Grove's heart. The clubhouse calendar is packed with events, potlucks, history nights, cultural festivals, each a celebration of the diversity Margaret had tried to erase, and I often catch neighbors exchanging smiles that carry the weight of shared redemption, a quiet acknowledgement of how far we've come from that day when prejudice nearly tore us apart. Margaret's downfall, though distant now, serves as a coda to our story. Her real estate license revoked, her business buried under lawsuits from residents she'd wronged. She's faded into a cautionary tale whispered by realtors who once admired her. Pine Grove's property values, her obsession, have climbed higher than ever, not because of her rigid standards, but because families seek out a place where inclusion isn't just a buzzword. It's lived, breathed, built into every corner, a truth underscored by the regional awards we've earned for our community model. I chose not to wield the full force of federal law against her or the HOA, a decision rooted in Michael's insight after his accident. Justice restores, it doesn't just punish. And this restoration has been more powerful than any courtroom victory, a neighborhood reborn not through vengeance but through the collective will to be better. Those who'd stood with us, Mrs. Davidson, the Johnsons, Mr. Rivera, Mrs. Patel, became the architects of this new Pine Grove, their courage matched by others who'd once stayed silent, now stepping forward to volunteer, to connect, to heal what Margaret's reign had fractured. One crisp evening, as I watched Michael and Cooper lead a group through the garden, explaining its features to newcomers, a neighbor approached. Mr. Thompson, the former board member who'd brought me wine and apology months ago, his face softer now, less haunted. "Judge Parker," he said, "I never thanked you properly. You didn't just stop her. You gave us a chance to fix ourselves." I waved off the title. "It's Sam, and it wasn't me. It was all of us, starting with Michael." He nodded, glancing at my son. "He's something else. You must be proud." I was prouder than he could know, watching Michael navigate not just the garden, but the life he'd reclaimed, his blindness a challenge he'd turned into a gift for others. Later, as the sun dipped low, Michael joined me on the porch, Cooper flopping at our feet, and said, "Dad, I used to think losing my sight was the end, but it was the start, wasn't it?" I rested a hand on his shoulder. "For you, for Pine Grove, it was the start of something truer than what we had before." Pine Grove stands as a testament now, not just to survival but to transformation. Confronting discrimination didn't only protect Michael. It freed everyone, proving that when the vulnerable are targeted, the powerful never expect the day true strength reveals itself. Not in titles or threats, but in justice, compassion, and a community standing as one. Margaret misjudged that strength, assuming her authority was unassailable, but she didn't account for a blind boy's courage, a father's restraint, or a neighborhood's awakening. Together, we rewrote her ending into our beginning, a story where the wreckage of cruelty became the foundation for something enduring. Michael's right. We don't choose our challenges, but we choose how they change us. And Pine Grove, like my son, chose to rise, a living proof that even the darkest days can lead to a dawn worth fighting for.